Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earl. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearl.com. In today's episode, I interview Eli Bedrosian on improving one's mood. Eli is a licensed professional counselor. He was trained in a residential treatment facility specializing in helping people who struggle with trauma and addiction. He is also a somatic experience practitioner and an EMDR trained therapist. So without further ado, here's the interview. What are some factors that impact a person's mood?
Okay, so there's a number of different factors that impact a person's mood, but some of the big ones include diet, sleep, any use of mood-altering chemicals, prescribed or not, what's going on at work, what's going on at school, relationships, sense of purpose, grief and trauma, childhood, what happens, attachment, health, and then also, predisposition or genes. And that's, one of the things that we have very little control over. The rest of the things we have some degree of control to affect change in those areas. Sure.
And with the people that come consult you, what do you see most often as some of those factors out of those factors you mentioned of what affects people's mood?
Yeah, so relationships is probably the biggest one, and sometimes there is people come see me about addiction or trauma issues, and a lot of times when we get into talking, it goes back to their relationships, either their current relationships that they're in, family, romantic, otherwise. And or their situation growing up as far as their childhood history when they were young. So relationships is a really big one. And again, addiction, trauma are two other ones that people come in for as well. Occasionally come in, because there's something going on at work that is difficult, or they're thinking about doing a career change or stuff like that. Yeah, so people don't typically come in to see me, which would make sense, for diet stuff or food or things like that. So, yeah.
Sure, great. And then, so, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are struggling with mood, whether it's depression or anxiety, shame. So what are some ideas that you could give our listeners to improve their overall mood?
Yeah. And so I'll start off by saying everybody's situation is different. But I think, going through each of these things that I named and kind of taking a look at, are there things that are out of balance for me, is a good place just to start. So just for example, if sleep is pretty sporadic or I'm not getting enough sleep, or I'm staying up way late into the evening time or things like that, that might be a first place just to kind of check. And then diet, as well. Am I eating balanced meals throughout the day? Is there a body image or things like that may be tied to that? The types of food that I'm eating, am I nourishing myself, appropriately? Am I getting enough water? It's really basic things like that. It seems simple, but sometimes we neglect that. We get busy with life. Obviously any mood-altering chemicals. So if you're drinking, if you're smoking, if you're even taking medication as prescribed, that can have a big influence on your mood. And so just checking in with your prescribing physician as far as how you're feeling and what's going on. If you're feeling off, if you're noticing some kind of sudden mood change or something like that, or feeling differently, to check in with them. As far as outside of those types of things, for self-regulation, there's a lot of things you can do on your own, and some of the stuff you may already be doing. but I'm a big believer in movement. I'm a big believer in mindfulness, and also I think highly of meditation as well. I think that keeping a journal can be a great way to self-reflect, to kind of get feelings out. A big believer in the arts and drawing and painting and self-expression. And I think a lot of times we have experiences, and life gives us these experiences, and sometimes we don't know what to do with them. And so being able to convey those in some kind of way. So again, with his journaling, with paint or artwork. Also, it could be other things, outside of that too. It could be cooking, it could be dance, could be, poetry, but allowing yourself to have the time and space as you can to be able to have a format where you can get that stuff out. All that stuff is self-regulation, things you can do by yourself. And there's a couple other ones just to kind of keep in mind is, I have a phrase, so goes the body, goes the mind. And I didn't coin that. I'm not sure where I heard that from, but I fully believe in it. And it's sort of like when we're feeling off and our mood is not doing great, it's kind of just cueing into our body. And is there a way for us to take care of our body and to sort of doing things like sometimes like wearing a heavy backpack, or sometimes using a weighted blanket, maybe something that can quell people's anxiety. Sometimes taking your shoes off and walking in the grass, just those kinds of sensory experiences. If you have sensitivities to light or something like that, sitting in a dimmer room or a darker room. For some people, going into like a walk-in closet or something like that, if you're really sensitive to noise, or having a pair of headphones can be something that really calms us down. If you're on the opposite end and you're struggling with depression and thinking about depression or just feeling sad, let's say, not necessarily just depression, thinking about things that may be more activating to help to regulate you in that way. And then again, sort of movements, activity, also engaging with others can be a useful thing. So those are just a couple of ideas as far as self-regulation, but paying attention to what your body is telling you, paying attention to how you're feeling, and obviously the context. So if there's stuff going on with your relationships, sometimes it's about going and talking to a person about what's upsetting you or what's going on, what's wrong. And then, so that a lot of the stuff I just talked about, self-regulation, and there's co-regulation, that pertains to our relationships. And so, again, having dialogues with people, but also, the presence of proximity with people. Sometimes we feel lonely, and so being around people that we know care about us, if they're available, accessible, is something really useful for us. I believe in the power of physical touch, just as far as hug, handshake, that kind of thing can really help us to feel like we're connected, and is there something in me that feels really disconnected or isolated or closed off, and maybe I need to connect and seek out that type of contact from people. And I think that's something that is really vital. And there's a lot of talk today, and I believe it's true, about, we are wired for connection. And so when we start living lifestyles or believe that we can do things entirely in a vacuum, so we can sort of do that, but then there tends to be this void in us that doesn't get filled up by food or sex or drugs or work or things of that nature. And so lots of discussion in mental health field about connection because we're realizing more and more that the relationships they're really vital. And relationships tend to connect to our sense of purpose as well. Sometimes when we're struggling with that, our sense of purpose, it's about our relationships, our connections, what we're offering to people, what we're allowing people to give ourselves, etc.
Wow, well, what a wealth of knowledge, eh? There's so much of what you just mentioned that was really resonant with me. One thing that just popped to mind I really appreciate all the different specific options that you gave for expression of what's going on, whether it's talking to someone or painting or doing some sort of other artistic expression or journaling. I know that a lot of those practices have been a huge part of my healing journey and a lot of my friends and family as well. So that was a wealth of information. Really appreciative of that. And so you were touching on at the end there how other people there, there's this connection where no one is lives in a vacuum, or we're very much so influenced by people around us. Will you expand on that a bit more as it pertains to our mood?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think beginning when we're kids, I think there's a notion that when our childhood shouldn't affect us. You move on, and you're an adult now, and time heals all wounds, and that's not true per se, as far as I'm concerned. And so, looking at the dynamics of how you grew up, as far as in my household, did I feel safe? Was there violence there? Was it okay for me to express my emotions? Was it not? Was there a presence of safe physical touch and nurturing, which is, I believe, absolutely vital to development? Was there a sense that I was supported and that I was able to kind of have my own identity, or was it more that things were really rigid and I need to comply to the rules? All those things are really critical as far as how we develop, and then the subsequent relationships that we choose, and all of those pertain to how we feel. And so, if I grew up in an environment that is more supportive of me, then the way that I feel about myself and my mood tends to be even more regulated. Of course, people still struggle for a variety of different reasons, including disposition and genetics and different things like that, but tends to be more well balanced. If I grow up in a household where there's more rigidity or there's the presence of neglect or abuse, I tend to struggle more with self-image and feelings about myself and mood, maybe generally. So those are in my mind kind of rules of thumb. And then so I think that also expands to our relationships throughout our lifespan. So if there's other people that are around us that are struggling with depression, we may be more likely to struggle with depression, especially if they're inside the same house with us. And so the way that people carry themselves is almost like, in a way, emotions or feelings were sort of like they resonate, right? They resonate. And so when we're around people who are a certain way, we tend to begin to feel similarly to how the environment that I'm in is. An easier way of saying that is, I believe that we sort of begin to internalize our external environments. And again, particularly when we are young, we really pick up on and absorb in what's going on as far as people. And then as we go through our lives, it's true as well. So things are going really well in your romantic relationship and your family, or well, for the most part, let's say, oftentimes, you're feeling okay. You're feeling like you can express yourself. Problems come up and you're able to resolve those issues or talk through them. You have your feelings tend to be more balanced. Your mood tends to be more balanced. You're feeling like people around you are really struggling, they're having hard times, or they're negative, or there's violence, going on around you, verbally, physically. That has an impact on your mood as well.
Sure.
The relationship, the circles that we travel in, deeply influence us as we influence them. It's a reciprocal thing.
Sure. And one thing that came to my mind, I'm actually reading a book by Gabor Mate on addiction, and he was mentioning how the human brain, the amount of development that happens after the infant is born. I think he said three quarters of the brain development occurs during that period. So as you're mentioning, those early experiences that someone just have such a profound influence on our mood and mood regulation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So you're trained in EMDR and somatic experience.
Yeah.
Will you tell us a bit about what EMDR is? I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar and some have heard it, but would like to learn more. So will you give us kind of the basics of EMDR?
Yeah. So the the basics of EMDR is a therapeutic approach used to process traumatic and stressful memories. And so one of the big parts about EMDR, at least the theory, is around bilateral stimulation. And so bilateral stimulation can occur in a number of different ways, but it can be sort of, your eyes moving back and forth. There's also, headphones, or what we have, light bars, where people, I guess, their eyes move back and forth with that as well. But there's also something called paddles, which are kind of like little buzzies, or little kind of buzzes like a cell phone in either of your palms. Some people use tapping on your knees or other parts of your body, but the big thing is back and forth. And that's thought to be part of what helps us process through stressful or traumatic memories, and to have them link with more adaptive memory networks. And when that happens, people often find that there's a positive change in their emotions, or a different interpretation of how we recall whatever the memory was. And so that's, for some reason it seems maybe kind of like it wouldn't work, but oftentimes my experience with people is that they're surprised at how effective it is, and how quickly it can work, and how powerful also the experiences can be.
So with that bilateral movement, is the idea that is what is relaxing, or is the person already kind of in a state of relaxation to then process those traumatic experiences, or both?
Yeah, so the aim is not actually relaxation. So oftentimes people are not relaxed in the process of EMDR. They can be very activated, and then they move towards more a state of deactivation or calm as they're processing through. So the aim or the goal is to select a memory that is distressing, and to bring down the level of distress around that memory, so that when you bring up that memory, it doesn't have the same kind of bite or impact on you.
Gotcha. And so it's that. So you're starting off with the distress, and then as the EMDR progresses, moving into that more relaxed, calm state.
Right. That's definitely the goal. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, and then how about a somatic experience? Will you give us a rundown on that?
Yeah, so somatic experience, it's a body-oriented approach to healing stress, healing trauma. And somatic experience draws quite a bit on mindfulness. And that is, and just to kind of double back just briefly here, so EMDR was started by a woman named Dr. Francine Shapiro. EMDR was started by a guy named Dr. Peter Levine. And so, again, somatic experience was quite a bit on mindfulness, and the part of the theory is, when we are in situations where we are threatened in a way where our bodies and our minds go into fight, flight, or freeze, there is a survival energy that is within us, and if we're not able to successfully defend ourselves, defend others, then sometimes that survival energy can get bound or stuck within us. That survival energy, fight, flight, freeze, is meant to be a short-term energy burst to get us out of a dangerous situation. So when the survival energy gets stuck like that, part of the theory around somatic experience is, we having a discharge of that survival energy through the process of talking about the event, but also allowing our body to tremble or shake. That can be kind of the process of discharging some of this survival energy, and in that way healing from the trauma or the traumatic situation that we were in. And so it's not always the case that someone kind of trembles or shakes, but it's pretty important that we can kind of get used to befriending our bodies and knowing what we're feeling.
Yeah, what pops in my head is, in our society in the United States, we're so often I don't know, I think put into boxes, with these dominant narratives that exist. And so I think of, if we were actually scared, there in our past or sad or whatever experience that was, there's often not many spaces for us to really express that. And so I could see that process being really helpful.
Yeah.
You've just touched on EMDR and somatic. How else would therapy with? I mean, I guess how have you seen therapy be helpful for your clients in general, or maybe like what are some stories for our listeners who may be struggling with mood dysregulation? That could give them some insight into what would happen in therapy.
Yeah. So I think that everybody's process in therapy is a little bit different. Everybody's journey is a little bit different. The first thing I will say, though, is that there is sort of I hope, a decreasing stigma around therapy, and it's seen as weak to be vulnerable, et cetera. And my thought is that everybody can use support. Everybody has issues in their lives where we struggle with insecurities, we have pain, we have different fears and things like that. And sort of based on, where you grew up, the current culture, family structure that you're in, we're more or less willing to say that and say that that's true. But just from my experience of being, doing therapy with people in my own life journey, I know that is what's true. So I think it's really a strength to come in and to talk about what is bothering you, what is upsetting you, to share that, to get feedback about that. And then my thing is to use your own inherent wisdom. A lot of times you have through the process of therapy, your own inherent wisdom is right there, and it just needs to kind of be coaxed, we'll say, or activated, or whatever the word you want to say, but processed through. And a lot of times your own innate intuition will kick in about whatever issue you're having, or if you're struggling with mood, about how to begin to improve that. Sometimes it's useful just to come up with, some kind of plan about, okay, here's some of the areas in my life that are out of balance, and kind of going forward, this is what I need to do to help myself. And I know that in the most effective types of plans with that, whether it's about mood or otherwise, it's having people, having accountability partners is something that can be really useful. People that we're sharing our story with, that know about us and know what we are struggling with. And so if that's therapist, if that's, if that is a buddy, if that's somebody in a 12-step group, having that in place is something that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. It brings to mind what you're saying about vulnerability, especially with men in our culture. We're often told this story that vulnerability is weakness, right? And then that might play into that stigma that exists in therapy. And I know one of our goals with this podcast is to give people a deeper glimpse into what therapy is, and to kind of start to break down that stigma. And then, as you're saying, show that vulnerability is actually ideal, and connection with others is what's supportive to us. So I really appreciate those words. Well, lastly, Eli, the question that I often end with is, I want to ask if there's a message of hope that you'd want to leave our listeners with.
Sure. My message to you is that there's help out there if you're willing to reach out. I've shared a lot of self-regulation stuff as far as mood. I've shared a number of ideas just around co-regulation with people and why I believe relationships are very important. And then, if for some reason it's not getting it done on your own, or you've been struggling with that, my suggestion is, to see a therapist, or go back to, a therapist that was really working for you, and to seek the guidance and to seek the help that you need. And so just to know that, sometimes we all struggle, we all depend on other people for our well-being, and just important to know that it's okay to reach out when you need help.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being on the podcast, Eli.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rate and review our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. A big thanks to Eli for the interview. The message that Eli left us with at the end to reach out to someone who's close to us, or maybe a psychotherapist who we've seen before, or go seek out a psychotherapist for the first time, I think is an important message to keep in the back of our minds. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapist. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, guest, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit psychologytoday.com to connect with a licensed clinician near you.